Hey listeners, DM Shay here. I know I can speak for both of us when I say this. Kyle and I are super thankful that you take time to listen to our podcast every time it downloads. We are super thankful for that. The reason I'm bringing this little clip to you is because when we recorded this specific episode, Kyle and I had just our email, dungeonmastertalk@gmail.com, to give us a chance to meet you, the listener, and have you give us feedback or comments or questions and things like that. But we hadn't started anything as far as social media platforms were concerned. I'm pleased to announce right now that we actually have recently launched an official Facebook page and Twitter handle. If you would like to connect with us on Facebook, you can find us on the Dungeon Master Talk podcast page. You can also find us on Twitter at DMT the podcast, as well as use the hashtag Dungeon Master Talk. As of this moment, Facebook and Twitter are the only two social media platforms that we are on, but who knows, that might change in the future. Again, thank you for joining us on Dungeon Master Talk. With that, here is our latest installment of the podcast.
Welcome to Dungeon Master Talk, a podcast specifically for Dungeon Masters by Dungeon Masters. I am your co-host, Kyle.
And I am your co-host, Shay.
And we want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to listen to us talk some Dungeons & Dragons from the DM's perspective. Shay, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here, Kyle. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. What are we going to talk about today, sir?
Today, we're talking about running adventures or encounters, as you'll hear it talked about in different circles. And it really probably depends on the group, how they describe these, but encounters is probably the more common word. We will talk about a few different types of encounters. We'll talk about a fighty fight. We'll talk about, a fighty fight. We'll talk about something called a skills challenge. And we'll talk just kind of random encounters that don't necessarily involve fighting or much dice rolling. Mm-hmm. So that being said, Kyle, how do you roll initiative when you... Well, actually, let me back up. So when we talk about encounters, right, most people think of encounters as fights. And one of the ways that people run fights is you basically at the beginning of the fight, you roll initiative. Kyle, how do you do initiative for your monsters and villains? Do you roll each monster individually, or do you roll them as a collective group?
Man, you asked me to reveal my deepest, darkest secrets to my play group, who's no doubtingly listening to this because they're my best friends.
They're falling asleep right now as we talk. We don't know.
Oh, for sure. Wholeheartedly. No, so honestly, that's a tiny bit of a loaded question. I know what you're thinking it shouldn't be, but honestly, it depends. And the reason I say it depends is it depends on the degree of intricacy I want for the encounter. If it's party versus 5 minions, 5 monsters, 5 whatever, criminal of the week types, then I'm probably, if it's that low of a number, going to roll in like 2 groups. That way I can break up the party and it's not just going to be good guys, bad guys. If it is party versus a whole host of bad guys, I'm probably going to roll the bad guys all together. That's a lot to simplify it on me. And then if it's party versus big bads, I am definitely going to roll those big bads individually because I'm going to be full into playing them and trying to live up each one of them as their full-fledged character that they've been built up in the campaign.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of do it the same way. Like usually if I have just a bunch of minions or not small onions, just, like little, I don't know, you want to call it like the hype guys, the new guys in the gang, new kids on the block, whatever you want to call them. I'll probably group those together, but once you start getting into like your leader / boss guy, evil overlord, then I'll start making them have their own initiative as well. I agree.
And I'll definitely do, if I have my evil overlord and he has his minions, I'll definitely do his minions together, or if he has like 2 stages of minions, each block essentially will get their own role. But the big bad, I will always separate out and roll him individually, him or her. My big reason for that is I want to make sure that big bad is treated special. And so in order for me to make sure I'm doing that, I am going to treat them special from the get-go. That kind of whole, like, you've heard, if you want to hear sound happy, smile. It's like, hey, if you want this villain to... Shay's laughing at me, listeners. I can see him on my recording. But if you want your big bad to feel special to your players, you got to start treating them special in your preparation as well. And even something as simple as rolling their own. More behind the screen for me.
Overlord, don't kill me.
I'll even sometimes designate dice during that big fight as these dice belong to the big, and I'm not going to roll them for the minions. And that's part of my whole like make them special. It helps me switch gears from like sometimes my minions aren't going to be as fleshed out. They're going to have pretty simplistic goals. They're going to have they're far more likely to disengage in the combat. They're far more likely to not do the intelligent things because they're not the big bad. I'm not as like the combat's not centered around them. They're the filler. They're to round out the difficulty to the degree I want for this. They're to add complexity to the battle, but they're not who the battle's about. Whereas my big bad, they're going to be changing the scenario every time they act. And so in order to help me shift into those gears, the big bad gets their own dice.
Confession, I actually, in the game that I'm running now, I actually had dice specifically made for my evil characters.
Ooh, that's next level.
I did. In our group that Kyle runs, we actually had a guy that was making his own dice for a while, and I called him up and said, hey, I need you to do me a solid. And so we were conspiring, and so I'm excited to break those out whenever that gets a chance to happen. So
you know those dice are going to go one of two ways. They're either going to have birthday dice level power, or they're going to be crit fall masters. They're just going to be critical fail after critical fail. One of the two.
Or Father's Day dice. We've established that birthday dice and Father's Day dice are kind of on the same level.
Yeah, one day I will get to know the blessing power of Father's Day dice, but today is not that day.
Well, sometimes my Father's Day dice are ornery, just like my other dice, and sometimes even more ornery than my regular dice. So, you win some, you lose some, and it is what it is.
Perfect representation of your children. All right.
You are so accurate. Yes.
So, sir, when you're working on your encounters, what would you say is like your bread and butter, your first go-to for when you're going to build an encounter? I'll make it easier because that's loaded, and every DM listening to that knows that that's super loaded. That
is a loaded question.
So okay. We just spent a lot of time talking about big boss final battles, but let's talk about your session 4 or 5. You guys are starting to get comfortable, but they're journeying from town to town, and there's been a lot of crosstalk. You're kind of losing them for a little bit, so it's encounter time. How do you do moments like that?
Well, I think it kind of breaks into two parts. Okay, there are the fights you plan for, and there are the fights that you don't plan for.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I mean by that? There are instances where you might be just trying to set up the scene, or you're trying to lead your players eventually to what they're trying to get to based on the tiles that they're kind of giving you back. And there could be instances where they just start a fight.
Yeah.
We actually this was a game that I was playing. This is in Pathfinder, so this is old school.
Ooh,
and I hope my druid is listening to this because I love this guy. But he and I were walking through this town. I was playing a paladin and he was playing the druid, and he was in dog form. And to make a long story short, we ended up at the back end of this butcher's kitchen. He tried to steal some food. The butcher hit him on the nose with a meat tenderizer. He flipped out, turned back into a druid, and caused this wall of water to explode the kitchen. And then we ended up getting arrested. Me being the goody good paladin, I was like, oh, I deserve this because I couldn't keep my friend from doing evil. He's like, oh, no, I'm out. And he just bust a flex up out of there, turned into a bird, and flew away. So,
classic.
Yeah, so it was one of those things where we weren't planning. I was not planning to start a fight. And then my druid was like, oh, no. I'm not getting into this. I'm busting a flex up out of here. And you're not getting me. So there was a little bit of a scuffle with the guards, to make a long story short. That was an impromptu fight, right? Yeah. Whereas, like, if the guys are going, and you are able to get them to sneak up on the castle. So they get to the castle, and, they're able to start sneaking in. They'll get to some of the guards that you have either planted there, or, they'll make a big kerfuffle, and then more guards will come and fight. But basically, that one would be more planned. Like, you have a specific area with specific people that are made to make a specific fight. So it's kind of two parts. And to me, it's one of those things where if I'm planning my encounters, I plan fights as they're absolutely needed. If I have an impromptu fight, I'm all for it. But I'm not going to necessarily plan a fight unless it's warranted, if that makes sense.
So you're saying your encounters that you plan for, they have to have a story-driven aspect. That's what you mean by warranted? Unless
you're just trying to get XP after XP after XP, like if that's all you're trying to do, then yeah, you can go fight. or if your group is just very fight heavy, or like they like doing a lot of fights and battles and stuff, that's totally fine. If you want to be more story driven, you literally got to kind of pick your battles when you're doing that, I think, because if you just go fight, you're losing the aspect of the story unless the fight makes sense to the story.
Right. So you definitely don't subscribe to the belief that every session, every play session needs to necessarily have an encounter.
Not necessarily a fight encounter, no.
Okay. So do enlighten. I know where the entire session of this. I know the point of this entire episode is encounters. It's adventures. And don't worry, listeners, we're going to get back to that. But Shay just mentioned something that I think is a great we're definitely going to go down this path. So not every session needs an encounter. Needs to have a fight encounter. And I also subscribe to the same aspect, because both Shay and I, in our campaigns, we both are very story-driven DMs. The tales that what we agreed upon with our players, remember we talked about in our previous episode, that expectation gathering, that we were coming together to tell a story. We were inspired by those token level novels where not everything is leading to an encounter that is a fight, but that there's other forms of payoffs in these types of stories. But if you're a DM out there, or you're a group out there that your players do expect an encounter every session, there's ways to do that to make that feel story driven still. You can definitely set up arena levels. You can have like some story take place while the combat's happening. There's definitely aspects that you can do there in order to make it still a fun story, but also still having those encounters for your players. Definitely make sure you're working that out. Now, Shay, I really want you to dive into detail what you were saying when you're saying the difference between fight level encounter. There's not always going to be a fight encounter, but you were kind of alluding to maybe there's going to be something else centric in that session. And then we'll come back to how we run the encounters when we do have them.
Here, help me understand your question. So are you saying like the difference between like fights and like impromptus?
No, I'm saying like I know every session, you and I kind of run things the same way. We have a payoff in mind for this session. And sessions don't go the way we plan every time, but that payoff's not always an encounter. Sometimes it's meeting a specific NPC. It's revealing some knowledge to the world. It's getting into somebody's lore, somebody's backstory. How do you kind of, then we'll switch back into the encounter gear, but give us like a soundbite for a future episode. So not full episode's length here, but how do you kind of guide those?
So I think when you get to encounters that are on purpose, from a DM's perspective, there's usually a tie in the fight to one of the players, like you were kind of alluding to. So let me give you a great example. So in the game that I'm running right now, we have a half-orc barbarian. I'll just make a quick run through it. Half-orc barbarian, shadow demon sorcerer, satyr warlock, and we have a wolf-kind rogue ranger mix. And in one of the fights that we had, the barbarian actually was standing nose to nose with one of the minions, if you will. And he kind of like, go ahead, make or bake a cake, I think is what he said. And the barbarian's like, oh, to heck, you're going down for this. And so he ended up smiting the guy. Well, after he killed him, I told the barbarian, I said, the mask that just fell off that guy's face, you remember that from your village when it was just decimated. Like there's a tie because he remembers that, and it pissed him off so much that he went into a rage, and he still ended up getting beat up by the mage, but that's another story for another day. But the point of what I'm trying to tell you is the mask triggered something in his brain from his memory that now he has a storyline to go with. So there was a reason for that fight where it took place, because that mask triggered something in his brain.
Gotcha. So having that hook is more what you're alluding to?
Yes. And especially because at that point we were like level 2, maybe level 3. So it was still fairly new in the campaign too. So I'm trying to give them like direction without forcing them down a path.
Right. Direction.
I'm giving them a hook to say, okay, I need to find out more about this or about that because of this encounter that I had back here. Or it could be like, okay, so you go through this fight and you beat all the bad guys and you're able to grill the big bad in that fight for information about the guy that's above him, or he ends up having a special artifact or a weapon that one of your mentors had, and it's like, how did you get a hold of this? Blah blah. And that could be another arc in your story to progress it.
Yep. In mine, directly alluding to that artifact, my direct payoff in the end. So my campaign's broken up into seasons, and so the payoff for my season one was the big bad. My wizard, big bad evil wizard warlock man, had the shiny special gem necklace, and in my world, it's also a gem of power. People who have been paying attention at all to movies might figure out what storyline I ripped off there from another publication.
I'm singing the theme song in my head right now.
But one of my players who plays a rogue, in his backstory, a wizard had stolen his shiny, this precious gem that was given to him by his father and was his to oversee as a family heirloom, and a wizard tricked him into giving it up and took off with it. And so he had been adventuring forever. I think I've alluded to that story before or even said it before. So my big hook there into the buy-in for the second season was this gem being the whole center point of that battle. So that entire battle, he was just chasing the gem, wasn't really caring what was happening to the other players. And the other players were trying to fight this big bad and the other stuff going on.
True.
So that was my hook there.
All right, so Kyle, should we kind of deviate back and kind of talk about like how do we run encounters proper?
Definitely. So I think really here, I know you and I differ greatly on how we prep these counters. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the tools I use and why.
Okay.
And then I'll let you either pick them apart and show them you won't be able to get me to change.
I won't do that.
And then you can tell us your ways, alternative methods, because the key here, and we've alluded to this before, is there's not a right or wrong. We just do things differently. And it's because we the way we work's different. So I utilize a tool online, D&D Beyond's Encounter Builder. And the reason I do this is because the encounter tables in the DM guide, I think it is, if memory serves.
DMG, yep.
Yep. Those, while I could work them, I don't always have my DM guide with me when I'm laying in bed at 2 a.m. or when I'm at the office and I have an idea or flying on an airplane. But I can, and that one, flying on an airplane is a bad example, but I can yank open on my phone because my phone folds out into a tablet. I can pull up D&D Beyond and do the encounter builder and build out. And I've built out probably like easily 50 encounters I've never actually used. But what I love about that tool is if you have resources in the tool, you can pick out any monster and see absolutely everything about it. I do not. I own several physical sources, so what I end up doing is picking them in D&D Beyond so I can run the encounter through there, but then I have the information on that monster or character, if you will, in the physical resources I own, if I own it physically versus digitally. So my reason for that is because early on, when I was purely trying to use the challenge tables, my math would be off sometimes, and so I would come in expecting this encounter to be hard for my players, and they plow right through it. So in order for me to kind of double check myself, no longer rely on my own math, I started using this online encounter calculator for it through that resource, and that's proven to help me out immensely. My encounters have been running smoother, and by smoother I just mean they're the challenge level I want for my players. So if I want a challenge, like a encounter for my players to feel like, we're in trouble here, this is hard, I can actually get that now, whereas before I was struggling to get that.
I gotcha. Yeah, so I actually have nothing against D&D Beyond, and by the way, we're not sponsored by D&D Beyond.
No,
but
we are not.
If they want to sponsor us, we would totally at least talk about it. But that being said, I'm a little bit more old school in that sense. I do use the DMG more as a way to build my encounters, and the veterans will probably be a little bit more apt to this. I don't know if, and I would love to hear your guys' comments too, whether you use more D&D Beyond, if you're more old school, like by the book.
Or if you use a different calculator, or if it's...
If you use an abacus, you get an extra 10,000 experience, because that's amazing.
Yeah, I'll give you an inspiration die if you use an abacus.
Yes, we will send you an imaginary inspiration die.
An imaginary physical gold encrypted affiliate NFT. Once we figure out how those work.
But the biggest thing with the table is you kind of treat it like a checking account, essentially, is the best way I kind of describe it. Is, okay, if, for example, you have 5 players and you want it to be like a fairly easy encounter because you want them to get to the big bad guy at the end of the night. Maybe you'd set it up for like they would all get, okay, so say for example, a 5th level, be 250 experience points divided by 5 people would be about 50 GP each or XP each. But basically how you're doing that is, and then you would go through the monster manual and you would say, okay, I know that for instance, this monster is worth 250 experience points. I can either buy one monster for 250, or I can buy 2 monsters for 125, or whatever that breaks down to. Basically, you basically buy your monsters for each encounter, but you have to determine how heavy of an encounter you want that to be. Now, with my players, and sometimes we do this to Kyle too, sometimes we absolutely walk through a difficult encounter, and sometimes we are getting our butts whipped in an easy encounter. Part of that's dice, part of that can be terrain, part of it can just be special effects that we just don't know about.
And definitely sometimes it's the players make sketchy choices, like zeroing in on something. So I've made this mistake a few times as a DM, and it's really not a mistake. It is, because it didn't go the way I intended. But sometimes while you're painting the picture, the theater of the mind, you'll describe something and one of your players will hold on to it. So for example, I'll try my best here. So, and I didn't prep this. This isn't, and normally, so don't judge me too hard. Normally for my sessions, if I do something like this, it's written out. So excuse me if this is terrible. But if you're describing, like, you have a fallen fort, party is trying to defend. So maybe you describe the prairie gold field that is spotted, it is drying up, drought land, and beaten paths lead up to the rear end of a fort with the crumbling walls that was once made out of stone that the rain and weather over the years has not been kind to. You can sort of make out the cornerstones that once divided out into separate rooms and even barracks and wall work for this fort, but it's now mostly crumbled remains. But at its center, a few small walls about chest high on the 6-foot warrior still remain. And you can get behind 3 walls of partial cover. Now, in describing that scenario, I didn't give out the dimensions. That's what the map's for. But if one of my players really held on to that path that I drew, and really, I'm, in my mind, like, the path to me is I'm just trying to describe where they came from, but he's like, this path's important, and he's all about defending a path. He's going to go down that way, leaving his party behind, and so the rest of the party is now forwarded up. They take off. You're down 1 person from what you calculated. That's really in the meat of this. They've removed themselves. They're isolated. Mm-hmm. That can take a counter that you calculated as medium, moderate, or even easy, and flip it, because now it's hard because you have 1 less person. Maybe that was your heavy hitter. Maybe that was your tank. Maybe that was your healer. Any of those roles removed from the party as a whole, and some of them, that's really detrimental if they're out alone. If that's your glass cannon, now with no cover, the glass part's going to be really on display. And so that's something that keep in mind when you're painting that theater of the mind's eye. And we're in a podcast format right now, so like that theater is really on display when we're talking here. But when you're playing in your sessions, if you have the capability to draw those maps, that'll help lessen those moments, because I'm definitely a person that I get into that theater of the mind's eye when I'm a player, so I want that a lot, but I struggle to give it as well as I get into it, if that makes sense. So even though drawing maps is also hard for me, I've had to work on improving both so that my players don't get into those situations where they're zeroed in on the wrong thing. Counterpoint, you can very much intentionally put in a red herring for your players in an encounter to make it fun and more interesting, add a twist. Because we've all been there, we've all done this 1,001 times if you've DM'd at all, and that is you started an encounter, it's on flat terrain, there is no cover, there is no real movement, everybody stands and fights, your wizard shoots the same 5 spells, your druid chooses the monster of the week to turn into, and your rogue rogues around a little bit and the fight ends. It's fun, you can enjoy it, but you do the same encounter enough times. So as a DM, that's on you to spice that up. It's not up on your players to change how they're playing. They're role playing their character the way their character would play. It's on you to change the scenario. So something that I did very recently in an encounter was entice that same rogue I mentioned before to not engage in the objective of the fight. So I had an army invading a keep that my party was defending, and I put season 1, we're in season 2 now, I put season 1's big bad standing on top of a raised up almost pillar landing above the party, but on full display for my rogue to see, and he was standing on the actual keep. So he was pretending to be a good guy for the others at the keep, but this was purely meant to entice the rogue, and it worked. The rogue removed himself absolutely from combat and just purely pursued season 1 big bad the entire battle. And that was my 100% hope coming into that as a DM, because if he engages, he's another high damage guy. I have 2 warriors in my party that I DM for that they're high damage. My wizard's been on point, maximizing his damage output. And my druid Shay, he does whatever the party needs. If they need another damage, he's there. If he's the tank, he's there. If they need healing, he's there. So the party is very good at combat. And if they have that other rogue in this scenario, the situations of preventing the minions of the day from building the ladder work to get up and invade the keep, preventing that's going to be fairly easy for the party. But if I remove that one rogue, my one rogue from that encounter, according to my calculator, it went from a moderate, which I know that the dice always favor them for some reason, and it always hates me, and it takes it to a hard, almost on the extreme level of difficulty. And so I was like, okay, rather than just increase the amount of minions and make this hard, but they're going to be doing what they always do, I want to add this intricacy, because then the whole party was really into what he was doing, and they all roleplayed it really well. That they didn't know he was doing because he went invisible. I didn't predict that part, but it went incredibly well. They roleplayed it well, and we had a fun encounter that they're still talking about when we get together and talk about how things are going. That's still on their mind, and that's what I was going for.
So one thing I would like to say, though, when you're doing that, and when you have encounters that end up going one-sided or the other, if it falls on the side of the DM where your minions, for whatever reason, you're rolling well that night and you're just trouncing your party, just because you knock them down doesn't mean that they're dead.
Exactly.
It's something that's very important to keep in mind. We kind of talked about that a little bit last episode, but at the same time, that could be a fun encounter after they wake up. Because what if they are of interest to the person that they're fighting?
Exactly. And you can always remember, guys, villains have motives, and the motive isn't always kill. And also they have a breaking point. Like, build that into your villains. When would they flee? You're probably like, obviously your players, they don't want their character to die. They're going to run away at a certain point, or try to get out at a certain point if they know they're not going to win. So why not play your villains the same way? They don't always have to fight to die. That's something I had to learn, because I kept investing into creating these villain NPCs and my party kept killing them. And so in order for me to progress the story, I had to design a way for them not to die. And I learned, like, I was sitting there one night just going, oh, well, I wouldn't stay.
He's not dead yet. Get him.
Exactly. So why have your villain stay if they wouldn't stay? Like, especially, what are they after, right? What is their motive? Is their motive, their soul's reason for being to defeat the party in this one battle? Or do they have a deeper motive that carries beyond?
Oh, yeah.
Getting back into individual encounters, and sorry if I'm cutting you off there, Shay. I really wanted to make sure we covered this one thing, because I think it's something that is very important and very strange in D&D. So if you're playing D&D 5e, I believe it is the same in 4th edition, but I'm not as familiar, so I'm going to need your help if I'm wrong, and can infuriate our fans who've been playing longer than me. But a round of combat, a full round around the table, is 6 seconds.
Yes.
So how do you handle player conversation and talking during that 6-second round of combat? Is it free action? Can they talk a book in 6 seconds?
No, not a book.
Okay.
No. 6 seconds. I would allow, like, okay, think I'm gonna reference Lord of the Rings here, right? Okay. So Gimli and Legolas, right?
Legolas,
they're running around, they're just killing everybody. They're doing the kill count.
Yep.
And Legolas kills the one guy or kills the three guys, and Gim's like, that only counts as one. Like,
yeah, I mean, it takes them
that
out.
would be a 6-second talk. Like, it was literally a one sentence, a pithy one liner. It was a, hey, you move over there, or a fall back or whatever. I would count that as a free action. If you're wanting to go like 2 sentences, I'm going to make that an action. Like 2 to 3 sentences has to be an action, because in 6 seconds, you're not going to tell me that you run 30 feet, say a book, and then whack somebody.
Right. So for
Like,
you, it's
that doesn't compute.
right. It's got to. So you're saying it's got to make sense for the rules of the world.
Yes.
And I think like that's something where players speaking as their character. How do you work the players wanting to strategize, quote unquote, out of game?
If they're talking strategy out of game, I'm not going to penalize them. If it's like, if they say, okay, time out, let's talk about this for a second, I'm good with that. If you're staying in character the whole time, then it's got to be quick.
How do you have your players communicate to you that moment? Do they have to declare out of character, or is it what voice they're using? How do you determine that?
I would prefer that my players say, okay, time out or something, or out of character. Give me some sort of signal. I want to think about what I want to do here. Give me some sort of signal or something that we're taking this out of character. If this is staying in character, I want it to be as realistic as we can. Because like I said, you're not going to say a paragraph in 6 seconds.
Right.
It's really not, like in my head, it's either you can say a paragraph or you can hit somebody.
Right. And I guess like the reason I want to talk about that is because this is something that I've heard hotly debated before. And I think it seems like people fall into one of two groups. The rules are everything, or if it's fun, it should matter. Like, if it's fun, it should count. And so I know for me, I've really tried to be in both, because I believe in the rules. If there are no rules to the game, what are we really doing here? But then also I want to make sure my party's having a good time. So that's something that I've matured as a DM. Have asked myself a bunch of times, is like, hey, how do I want to keep handling this? This is how I've been doing it. Is it the right way? Because I used to be a lot more loose with that. I think you can attest that when we first started my sessions, I would let players get away with more in combat. A lot more cross-talk was allowed to happen. And also, they were lower level. A lot of them were learning the game. I was learning being a DM. We were fast and loose with the rules. But as they've matured as players and I've matured as a DM, I'm definitely getting a lot more into that camp of, if you could say that in 6 seconds, like not like what I've just said here, which was a lot more than 6 seconds, then by all means. But otherwise, you're not going to take that swing too. Yeah,
and like we've talked about in previous episodes, the rules, and the book actually says this, the rules are guidelines.
Exactly.
If it is not fun for your group, you are allowed to change, modify, or erase whatever that is. So if you guys want to make it to where, you can have a full-blown conversation in 6 seconds, that's your group's prerogative. For me, like I said, I want to keep it as fun and real to an extent that I can. But again, the rules are bendable, breakable, and amendable as we decide that they need to be. So on that line, let's kind of jump out of combat proper, because I really want to jump into something called skill challenges. And I don't remember exactly if the 5th edition book talks about this, but I'm pretty sure previous editions do. Yep. And I like skill encounters and skill challenges because as I've heard Rodrigo from Critical Hit to explain this, and I have to give him props because of the rule set that he uses as well for this, because it prompts a lot of creativity from the players and it gets them engaged without them having to, I hit somebody with a stick, I cast a spell, I backstab somebody. Like, it's a whole different type of encounter, right?
Right.
So for a skill challenge, what that is basically you still roll initiative just like you normally would, only there's usually not a bad guy proper. It's just the party itself. And what they do is you use the skills that you have, so athletics, acrobatics, stealth, nature, survival, whatever, to basically help get you from point A to point B in the story, and then you can take off and go from there.
Right. So the big thing with them, though, is that skill that you're using, you kind of want to paint a picture with. So, if you're saying you're on a platform pulling by rope, hopefully, I'm spitballing here. It really wasn't prepared for a situation there.
You're good. You're good.
So I wouldn't be able to say that I'm using my wisdom to pull on the rope.
It has to make sense.
Yeah, so I would want to say that, like, in that case, I'm using my athletics and I'm getting low in my squat, and I'm really like getting into it and rope course pulling myself to pull the party with me, and like describing that, and that can be an opportunity for the players to kind of work their ability to cast into that theater of the mind eye and describe how they're working it based on the role, of course.
I agree. And the one, and like I said, I really want to give Rodrigo props for this, because the rules, I think he calls them the Lord Kensington rules.
That sounds right.
It's basically how it breaks down is, okay, you can roll any skill that you have, whether you're proficient in it or not, but you cannot roll the same skill twice in a row. So like if I was using acrobatics, I cannot use acrobatics two turns in a row, and I cannot use the one that somebody else just used.
Right. So the player right before you in initiative, if they used
stealth, for example, or if the guy in front of me used stealth, I cannot use stealth this round. I have to pick, survival or perception or whatever. But the next round, I can't use survival. I can use stealth, if that makes sense. So you can't use the one that was just used in front of you, and you can't use the same skill 2 times in a row. And I think what that does is, it forces you out of like the 2 or 3 skills that somebody's probably really, really good at. And it forces you to kind of narratively, pick up the story from a different angle with your character.
And I think that that's really important, because it gets players to also kind of recognize, hey, I'm not so good at X skill. Like, I'm not very charismatic. And so maybe then they'll build on that, because if you have a skills challenge that isn't physical so much as it is, like, maybe it is around charisma and deception and stuff like that, and they realize, like, oh man, the rest of the party, they could really do stuff, and I was getting us our strikes during the skill challenge. Maybe then their next level up, they might invest into those other skills and round out their character. Or maybe they'll embrace the fact, like, hey, I'm not so good at that. The party's going to carry me in those situations. And I'm going to go ham on the skills I'm good at, because the rest of the party isn't good.
And sometimes your dice actually kind of surprise you a little bit. Or your character kind of surprises you, because like you could have like a 1 in survival, and you pick survival just for kicks and shenanigans, and you roll a 19. Like sometimes like your character will be good at something, and there's no real rhyme or reason for it. They just naturally are for whatever reason. But sometimes there's a skill that they are trained in, and they're just terrible at it.
Yep.
And again, no rhyme or reason necessarily why that happens, but that's kind of the way it happens. Now, the parameters of this skill challenge, again, like how you win or lose, typically, from what I've heard of it, it's usually you need to get anywhere from 6 to 10 successes, and you have like 3 or 4 failures. Whichever one, if you fill up all of the successes column first, you win. If you fill up all the fails, you lose. Now, you as the DM, you get to decide, okay, they made all of their skills successfully. Now I can give them an advantage of like, oh, you find this secret passageway into wherever. Or you can be like, oh, they failed all skill challenges. Oh, you got spotted in the center court of a castle, and now you're getting shot at from all directions. And roll initiative.
Or you just unleashed the bigger, the big bad secret monster that you were out here to squash. It's now released into the world. How are you going to handle that?
So, I mean, there's parameters to that, but I like it because it makes it interactive with you and your players. So that way they get a chance to kind of help you build the story for a little bit and in certain moments at a time. And then you can kind of run with that with them into whatever the next part of your story is.
And with these, I do want to point out that it doesn't have to be necessarily that you're running a skills challenge or an encounter. You can have a skills challenge lead into an encounter. You can have a skill challenge interrupt rounds of combat in an encounter. You can also have, in either one of these, a time clock scenario going on. The villains are progressing something in the background. So some of my favorite encounters that I've been involved in as a player, and some of my favorite encounters that I've ran as a DM, there was something happening that the players had to overcome that wasn't necessarily the minions they were fighting, the monsters of the week that they were taking on. So like maybe a room's flooding and you need to stop the flood, but while it's flooding, there's giant spiders that are floating on top of the water trying to eat you at the same time. So if you ignore the spiders, ouchie, they're going to get you, but if you ignore the room, you're going to drown.
Yeah.
And so maybe every round of combat that they don't do anything about the water rising, they lose 2 feet. And so the first couple of rounds they're able to focus on the spiders, but then now it's up to their waist and your halflings drowning. So stuff like that. It makes the encounters just a little bit more interactive. Gets that sense of urgency, and a sense of urgency helps with roleplay. Because when you can get the adrenaline pumping in someone, just think of it like when you're watching your TV show. If you're on the edge of your seat watching it, that ability to suspend belief for a minute, it's a lot easier. It comes more naturally when the adrenaline's pumping and you're invested in it. So if you get that clock going, especially if you have some players that maybe the last couple sessions you've noticed they're zoning out a bit more, get them under some pressure in the clock. They might find something fun with their character and invest back in. And if that doesn't work, then it's time to have a talk with that player and see what's up.
Something else, and real quick, just to kind of put a bow on this one, I think if let's just say you're doing a dungeon crawl and you have a fight in one of the first rooms, sometimes spells have a sound effect that goes like 300 feet. Please keep in mind that not everybody else is just going to sit there and wait for somebody to come attack them.
Yep.
So that could be, a minion hears a sound from down the hall, and now they have to go investigate and see what that is. So you could kind of create like a wave effect in that respect if your encounter calls for that. Sometimes they might just be sleeping and not even paying attention at all. So your players do well. They might be able to get the jump on the next room. So just kind of keep that in mind too as you're creating these encounters. Be spatially aware of what's going on around them, and as well as for the villains as well.
Listeners out there, if you're having problems coming up with these scenarios, making your encounters fun, and maybe you're just like, this isn't the part of it that really comes naturally or is fun for you to make these, there are resources out there. We're not sponsored by any at this point in time, but there's books. There are pre-module, like you do not have to play the story that is in one of the modules. You can make your own story and use the encounters. That is 100% A-okay. And if that is what makes it fun and best for you, feel free to do so. Just whatever can make it fun for your players and give you guys that fun story to remember while you're sitting around a table together. And with that in mind, guys, if any of you have any questions or comments related to this topic or others that you would love to hear us cover in DMT, or if it's just like, Kyle, I 100% disagree with you, you're 100% wrong on how you describe that fort, please let us know at the email address that Shay will totally tell you, and not at all because I don't remember it.
You can write us at dungeonmastertalk@gmail.com. Again, guys, we just really appreciate you spending the time with us. I know you guys are busy making supper or driving in the car with your kids or going, driving home from work. And we appreciate that you spend that time with us. So we just really appreciate you just being here with us during this session. So,
and I know, guys, that we put out a few of these episodes. Maybe you've written us an email and we haven't called it out. Please be patient with us. We do record these in batches. We will get back to you either via email or right here live on the show. And we just thank you all for listening. And for all of us here at DMT, he is
Jay,
and I am Kyle, and we'll see y'all next time.